The shutters groaned first, as they always did in the deep of a January morning, their iron hinges contracting against the cold that had settled over Ashvere Hall since the last week of December, and showed no inclination to depart, a cold that pressed itself against the stone walls like a patient creditor, testing each casement, threading itself beneath every door, until the great house seemed less a dwelling than a held breath, waiting for something it could not name. A rook called once from the frozen park and fell silent, and the sound dissolved into the grey air of 1817, as though it too understood that this was a place where sound did not linger long. The portraits in the upper corridor had grown accustomed to watching an empty staircase. The velvet on the long settee in the east drawing-room had dulled to the colour of a bruise, its nap flattened in the centre where no one had sat for years, and the hearth beneath the carved overmantel held only the memory of warmth, a pale residue of ash that the housemaids had not touched since the housekeeper had ceased to see the point of it. Room by shuttered room, Ashvere Hall endured its own silence, a house that had once been full of music and argument, and the quick step of a young mistress who had vanished so completely that even the servants, hired afterward, could not have said with certainty that she had ever existed at all. In the housekeeper's parlour on the ground floor, where the cold was slightly less absolute and a single candle burned in its pewter holder on the work table, a young woman sat mending a hem. She was 29 years of age, though she looked somewhat older in the candlelight, the shadows gathering in the fine lines that patience and circumstance had pressed between her brows and at the corners of her mouth. Her name was Eleanor Vane, and she had arrived at Ashvere Hall 4 days ago in the company of Lady Cecily Ashvere, who had engaged her in Bath as a companion and who knew nothing beyond what the letter of introduction had stated, that Miss Eleanor Vane was genteel, capable, and in need of a situation. That her needle moved with the quiet economy of a woman long accustomed to making things last was a truth no one here had thought to remark upon, and Eleanor was content that they should not. The hem was of no great consequence. The glove beside it, its third finger darned twice over in thread that did not quite match, was of rather more consequence, though it had no visible audience. She drew her stitch through the wool and did not look up. On the parlour mantelpiece, between a china shepherd and a candlestick that wanted cleaning, a letter had rested for 3 days. It was sealed with plain wax, its direction written in a hand that Eleanor had recognised at once, and had not permitted herself to examine at length, a hand she had not seen in 8 years, formed in the particular slant of a boy taught by a severe tutor in a schoolroom she had never entered but could somehow picture precisely. She had set the letter there upon finding it among the correspondence Lady Cecily had handed her to sort, and she had not moved it since, and she had not broken the seal, and she had told herself, with the steady reasonableness that had become something very like her entire character, that there was nothing within its folds that required her immediate attention. The candle guttered. She steadied it with 2 fingers and returned to the hem. Outside, on the long avenue of beeches that curved up from the south gate, hooves struck frozen ground in the particular staccato that meant a horse ridden hard, an outrider by the sound of it, the advance of a larger party, the Duke returning to the estate he had not occupied since autumn. Eleanor Vane knew this. She did not set down her needle, she did not rise from her chair, she did not cross the 3 steps to the parlour window and draw aside the curtain to watch the avenue. She simply sat and drew her thread, and listened to the rook call once more from the park, and let the shutters groan, and let the great house hold its breath around her, as it had been holding it, she suspected, for very nearly as long as she had been holding her own. Memory has a cold of its own, quite apart from the frost that pressed against the carriage windows as Eleanor had arrived the previous afternoon. It settles in the chest rather than the fingers, a stillness that no hearth can reach, and it had been with her, quiet and faithful, for the better part of 8 years. Now, lying in the narrow companion's bed that Lady Cecily's household had assigned her, Eleanor Vane listened to Ashvere Hall breathe in its sleep, the long exhale of a draughty corridor, the tick of contracting stonework, and the memory she had kept folded as carefully as any document rose, unbidden and entire, into the darkness above her. It was November, 1809. She had been 21, and the chapel at Renfield Cross had smelled of tallow and cold earth and the last of the season's lavender, someone having laid a small bunch beside the altar as though in apology for the season's severity. The candles, 3 of them only, had guttered in a draught that came from nowhere Eleanor could identify. Some fault in the old stone, some memory of wind the walls had absorbed across 2 centuries. Their light had been insufficient and perfect all at once, casting more shadow than illumination, and it had seemed to Eleanor that the darkness gathered around them like a congregation of its own, witnesses of a more patient and permanent sort. Julian's hand had been cold in hers. She remembered that with a precision she had never managed to apply to his face as it had looked in that moment. She could reconstruct the architecture of it, the strong line of jaw, the eyes that were grey in daylight and almost colourless by candlelight, but the expression itself had always blurred at the edges when she reached for it. His hand, however, she knew. The slight roughness at the first knuckle, the way his thumb had pressed against her palm, not as reassurance, but as though he were memorizing something. Old Reverend Marsh had spoken the words from the Book of Common Prayer in the manner of a man reading familiar instructions, not without feeling, but without ceremony, which had suited the occasion precisely. There had been no flowers beyond the apologetic lavender. There had been no wedding breakfast, no guests, no public register in the parish church of a village where someone might have recognized a duke's ward and carried the news to Ashvere before the week was out. The register at Renfield Cross was a small and unremarkable thing, kept in the vestry in a wooden box that smelled of damp. Reverend Marsh had been old even then, his hands unsure with the pen, his signature a careful tremor. He had wished them well with a sincerity that Eleanor believed utterly, and he had said nothing to anyone. And he had died the following spring, carrying whatever he knew into a churchyard she had not since visited. Julian had explained it all beforehand, and she had listened, and she had understood, and she had loved him enough to accept each condition as the price of a thing she wanted with the whole of her sensible, unguarded heart. His guardian, Lord Pemberton, held the estate's debts as a man holds a leash, with no intention of releasing it unless the terms were met precisely. A ward who married without consent forfeited everything. The estate was not profitable. There were tenant obligations, a mortgaged wing, a younger sister to be settled, 1 season more, Julian had said, perhaps 2. Long enough to manage Pemberton to reach his majority in a manner that left the estate intact and the tenants housed. She had nodded. She had signed her name in the register beside his, and she had taken the folded certificate from Reverend Marsh's hand, and she had placed it inside the cover of the small prayer book she kept in her travelling case, and she had understood herself to be, in all the ways the law permitted, the Duchess of Ashvere, a fact known to 3 people, one of whom was now beneath the ground in Renfield Cross churchyard. The certificate's edges were soft now. She had not meant to handle it so often. In the early years it had seemed important to verify. in the small hours of various rented rooms and her father's house and her cousin's spare chamber, that the thing was real, that the ink had not faded, that the names remained legible, that November 1809 had in fact occurred, and not been a construction of a young woman's excessive imagination. Julian's letters had come regularly for a time, and then less regularly, and then with a quality of careful distance that she had tried for a long while not to read as meaning what it plainly meant. The last letter had arrived 2 years and 4 months past. She had not opened the one that waited for her on the mantelpiece. She was not yet equal to whatever it contained. Ashvere Hall settled around her in the winter dark, and the cold of memory remained precisely where it had taken up residence, quiet and unhurried, in the kept place beneath her ribs. The great hall of Ashvere breathed cold that afternoon, as though the house itself had drawn a long breath and forgotten to release it. The flagstones pale as ash beneath Eleanor's feet, the chandelier overhead threaded with tallow smoke and the ghost of last winter's frost, the whole vast space holding its silence the way old stones hold the memory of rain. She had arrived in the carriage with Lady Cecily not 2 hours before, her trunk modest, her references carefully lettered in a hand that was not quite her own, for she had taken pains, these last weeks, to become Miss Vane of nowhere in particular, Miss Vane who read aloud with a clear voice and asked nothing of anyone. The pretence cost less than she had expected. It was the stone floors that cost her. She remembered them. A November morning 8 years ago, a draught beneath the chapel door, the cold finding her through thin slippers, while Reverend Marsh's voice murmured above the candle flame. She put the memory down as one sets down a cup one has no right to carry, and turned to follow Lady Cecily across the hall. He was standing at the far end beneath the portrait of his grandfather, and Eleanor understood in the space of a single heartbeat that the 8 years had not been gentle with him. The Duke of Ashvere was thinner at the temples, stiller in his bearing, the particular stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself away from rooms he inhabits. His coat was dark, almost funereal, and on his left hand she could see the mourning ring he had worn at the funeral of his guardian 3 winters past. She had read the notice in a borrowed newspaper in a lodging-house in Bath, and she had felt something she was not prepared to name. He glanced toward them as Lady Cecily called his name. Eleanor dropped her eyes. When she raised them again, he was already looking elsewhere. Lady Cecily made the introduction with the gentle efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing households and nephews in equal measure. "Miss Vane," she said, "my new reading companion of whom I wrote to you last month, though I suspect you did not read my letter with any great attention." The Duke inclined his head. His gaze moved over Eleanor with the same careful courtesy he might have extended to a piece of furniture brought from town, adequate, unremarkable, placed where it would cause the least inconvenience. There was no flicker, not the shadow of a flicker. 8 years had altered her more thoroughly than she had allowed herself to believe. Her hair darker now, dressed closer to her head, in the fashion that had come in since the peace, her face stripped of the unguarded eagerness that had been the chief feature of the girl he married in a cold chapel in November. "Miss Vane," he said. He said nothing further. The tea was brought at 4:30 in the blue sitting-room, the fire newly built and the curtains drawn against the early dark of December. Eleanor poured, as was her station. She was careful with the cups. When she carried his across the low table, their hands did not meet. She set it down before he reached for it, with a precision that was not quite composure, but would pass for it, and his attention had already returned to the letter open on the arm of his chair. The cup sat between them on the marquetry table, sending its thin ribbon of steam toward the ceiling. Eleanor returned to her chair beside Lady Cecily and folded her hands in her lap. Her left glove had been mended at the third finger, a small, careful darn in a slightly different thread, and she kept that hand turned inward, a habit so old it required no thought. That evening, by candlelight, she read aloud from a novel Lady Cecily had chosen. Something of the improving sort, a country family, a succession of small misfortunes resolved by patience and good character. Her voice did not tremble. She had known it would not. She had schooled it over 8 winters of reading to herself in empty rooms, and it obeyed her now as reliably as the tide obeys the pull it cannot name. Lady Cecily fell asleep before the 3rd chapter. The candle guttered. Eleanor closed the book on her thumb and sat for a moment in the near dark, listening to the house settle around her, its beams contracting against the cold, its corridors holding the dim sound of distant footsteps, his, she supposed, in the study above. She was here. He did not know she had ever been away. The library at Ashvere Hall smelled of beeswax and slow dissolution, of vellum gone amber at its edges, of oak shelves that had absorbed 2 centuries of winter, and would in all likelihood absorb 2 more before anyone thought to mend the cornice above the eastern window, from which a thin grey seam of daylight had lately begun to press. Eleanor Vane stood upon the 2nd rung of the library ladder, with a volume of surveying maps open across her forearm, and the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is its own form of safety. Lady Cecily had asked her to catalogue the estate holdings. She had not asked for anything further, and yet the Duke of Ashvere, who might easily have passed along the corridor to his study, did not pass. He stepped through the library door, observed her there among the folios, and did not leave. The fire had burned low. Neither of them remarked upon it. He moved instead to the table nearest the window and stood with his hands clasped behind him, looking at the grounds as though reading something written in the frost-pale grass below. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful flatness of a man who has long since ceased to expect his words to find a sympathetic resting place. He said the west wing roof would not last another winter without scaffolding. He said he had 3 tenant families in the north quarter, whose leases he could not at present honour with the repairs they were owed. He said these things to the middle distance, to the frost, to no one in particular, and Eleanor, who held the surveying maps and knew their every notation from 8 years of keeping her own counsel, understood that she was being spoken to in exactly the manner a man speaks when he no longer trusts himself to ask for the thing he actually needs. She descended 1 rung of the ladder. She said that the North Quarter holdings appeared on the 3rd folio, and that the drainage surveys from 1804 might offer a clearer account of where the damp was entering the foundation. Her voice was level. It was always level now. She had made it so across 8 years of practice in rooms where being otherwise would have cost her something she could not afford to lose. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the measured attention of a man unaccustomed to being answered usefully, and for a moment the library held its breath around them, the way houses do when they recognize before their inhabitants do that something is shifting in the air between 2 people who ought, by every ordinary measure, to be strangers. On the writing table a beeswax candle guttered, a long, slow lean toward its own shadow. He crossed the room and trimmed it without being asked, his hand certain, the gesture so entirely domestic that it seemed to belong to a different version of this evening, one in which the intervening years had not occurred. Eleanor watched the flame straighten and steadied herself by the maps in her hands, by the cool, familiar smell of old paper, and surveyor's ink. He did not explain the gesture. She did not require him to. There are kinds of knowledge that live below the reach of explanation in the hands and in the body's memory, and that resurface without permission in the presence of the particular person who first placed them there. He said, quietly, as though trying the sound of it, "Miss Vane." 2 words. A courtesy. Nothing more, the ordinary address of a gentleman to a lady whose Christian name he had no sanctioned right to use. Eleanor felt it land differently than it should. She felt it in the way one feels a key turn in a lock one had believed rusted, permanently shut. Not with hope, precisely, for hope was a luxury she had long since set aside, along with other girlish things, but with the faint, unwelcome tremor of recognition. She returned her attention to the folio. She said she would have the North Quarter survey notes transcribed and left for his review by morning. He said that was very good of her. The fire settled into itself with a low sound, and the frost pressed on against the glass, and the Duke of Ashvere stood a moment longer in the library of his failing house, as though he, too, were cataloguing something, some quality of steadiness in the woman on the ladder that he could not yet name, but that he was, without quite meaning to, beginning to depend upon. The library at Ashvere Hall held its breath in the early hours, when frost crept along the mullioned panes in delicate lacework, and the cold pressed its pale cheek against the glass, as though listening. It was in that particular stillness, the kind that belongs only to great houses, before the servants have stirred the first fires, that small and wordless things acquired a weight entirely disproportionate to their size. Eleanor Vane had learned, in the 8 years since she had last been mistress of these rooms, that Ashvere communicated in precisely such a register, not in declarations, but in the angle of morning light across a hearthstone, in the creak of a particular stair, in the scent of beeswax and old leather, that the house exhaled like a long-held secret. It was, she had always believed, a house that remembered. She had simply ceased to trust that she was among the things it chose to keep. The volume she lifted that morning was the 7th in a sequence of estate histories, its calfskin spine rubbed pale at the corners from decades of dutiful consultation. She had marked it the previous evening, intending to note the acquisition date and cross-reference it against a ledger entry she had found troublingly inconsistent. The work was methodical, absorbing, and possessed the great mercy of requiring concentration rather than feeling. She opened the cover. Between the title page and the first leaf of text, pressed with a care that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident, lay a sprig of dried lavender. It was not old. The colour had not yet faded entirely to that pale silver grey that years produce. It retained a ghost of violet, the faintest bruised warmth. Someone had put it there recently. She stood without moving for a long moment, the volume open in both hands, the lavender resting in the gutter of the binding, like a quiet declaration that refused to name itself. She could not be certain it was meant for her. That was, she would later understand, precisely the torment of it, not the gesture itself, but the impossibility of knowing. Any person in the household might have opened that book. Any hand might have pressed that sprig between those pages for reasons wholly unconnected to her presence. The uncertainty did not diminish the sensation, it deepened it, the way a room appears larger in dim light than in full illumination. She set the volume on the catalogue table and went on with her work, though the morning felt altered in some quality she could not precisely name. It was the footman Thomas who, in an entirely unguarded moment of conversation with the housekeeper, mentioned that he had observed his Grace crossing the library before first light, moving quietly in the direction of the east shelves. He had thought little of it. The Duke was known to sleep poorly. The housekeeper had noted it with the mild professional curiosity of a woman who catalogued human behaviour as Eleanor catalogued books. Neither account reached Eleanor directly. She heard it, as one hears many things in a household of this kind, in passing, at the edge of another exchange, standing in the corridor outside the still room with a list of ink-damaged bindings in her hand. She received it without expression and carried it away inside her, like a stone held in a closed fist. Lady Cecily remarked upon the catalogue's progress at tea in the gentle, circuitous manner she employed when she wished to say something without the inconvenience of saying it plainly. "His Grace," she observed, pouring from the silver pot with unhurried precision, had expressed himself gratified by the care being taken with the East collection in particular. He had always, she added, found the library the truest room in the house. Eleanor thanked her with the exact degree of composure that the moment required and nothing beyond it. That evening, she sat beside the window in her small room off the north corridor, watching the frost thicken on the glass in patterns that might, if one were inclined towards such readings, resemble the branching of a plant. The lavender sprig was in her hand. She had not decided to bring it upstairs. She was simply, somehow, in possession of it. She turned it slowly between her fingers in the failing light, feeling the tiny flowers give way one by one, releasing their scent in brief and fading increments until the stem was bare and the fragrance hung in the cold air of the room, like the memory of something that had once, in another life, been entirely hers. The afternoon arrived in pewter and silence, the sky above Ashvere Hall pressing low against the chimneys, as though the house itself had drawn a long, held breath. A cold had settled into the stone passages overnight, the kind that crept beneath doors and wound itself around ankles, and the great entrance hall smelled of beeswax and damp wool, and something sharper still, the particular chill of company expected. Eleanor Vane stood near the window embrasure, a catalogue ledger open in her hands, though her eyes had long since ceased to read, and she listened to the carriage wheels on the gravel below with the careful stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is its own form of armour. 2 carriages. The sound of it carried through the glass, muffled and inevitable, like a sentence already spoken in another room. Miss Arabella Ford descended first, and even at that distance, through the watered glass of the upper hall, there was something declarative about her. The sweep of a travelling gown in deep plum velvet, the absolute certainty of her step upon the stone, as though the ground were obliged to receive her. Her mother followed, smaller, watchful, her bonnet ribbons whipping in the November wind. The solicitor's arrangement, Eleanor had heard it said, as though a marriage were a letter of conveyance, a matter of acreage and income properly consolidated. She had heard it said twice, and each time she had set down whatever she was holding and found something else to occupy her hands. They were brought into the entrance hall, and Eleanor descended the servants' stair, as was proper for Lady Cecily's companion, to assist with the settling of things. The small domestic choreography of arrival that falls to those whose presence is useful and whose name is not required. Arabella Ford was already unwrapping her cloak when Eleanor reached the lower passage. She did not look up. She held the cloak out at arm's length, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond Eleanor's left shoulder at the plasterwork, at nothing in particular, at the shapeless middle distance that exists between a person of consequence and the woman she does not see. "Take this," she said. "It is thoroughly damp. The voice was not unkind. That was perhaps the particular quality of the cruelty, that it required no unkindness whatsoever, only the complete absence of notice. Eleanor took the cloak. The wool was cold and heavy with outside air, and she folded it once, twice, the gesture automatic and unhurried, the fold neat as a letter sealed. She did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more plainly. Arabella was already turning toward her mother, already gesturing toward the drawing room, already deciding where to sit, how long to stay, whether the chimney-piece was to her taste. Eleanor carried the cloak toward the side passage, where the damp things were laid to dry, and she did not look back, and she did not hurry, because neither looking back nor hurrying would have altered anything at all. He was there. She saw him from the corner of her eye as she passed the doorway of the green corridor, Julian, the Duke of Ashvere, standing with his hand on the doorframe in the particular way he stood when something had arrested him, and he had not yet decided what to do about it. His eyes were on her. She felt the fact of it the way one feels a fire across a cold room. Not warmth exactly, but the knowledge of warmth, its possibility, its direction. He did not speak. She did not slow her step. The cloak was folded over her arm, and she walked on. At dinner she was absent from the table, as was fitting. The dining room would have been warm and bright and full of the particular performance that wealth performs for itself. Crystal, catching candlelight, conversation shaped for an audience. Lady Cecily found her in the kitchen passage an hour into the second course, seated on a low wooden stool near the cold hearth, where the scullery girls warmed themselves before the ranges, a plate of bread and potted meat balanced upon her knee. Eleanor sat very straight. That was the thing Lady Cecily noticed, and could not quite speak of. The absolute, considered straightness of Eleanor's spine, as though she had decided, in the absence of any other dignities, to keep that one. On her right hand lay a darned glove, the mend visible at the third finger, neat and patient, the thread a fraction lighter than the leather surrounding it. Every door in Ashvere Hall had its proper side, and the glove knew, as Eleanor knew, and as the house itself seemed to know in the settling of its old cold bones, which side of each door she stood upon tonight. The study smelled of tallow and old paper, of a man long dead, and the ordered industry he had left behind, ledgers ranked by year, correspondence tied with brown ribbon, a world reduced to its documentary residue. Julian, Duke of Ashvere, had not intended to begin this task on so cold an afternoon. The fire in the grate had not been lit, and the December light came through the tall windows, flat and without warmth, laying pale rectangles across the turkey carpet, as though the room itself were reluctant to assist him. He had been clearing his guardian's papers for 3 weeks, a little at a time. The way one approaches a wound one suspects is deeper than it first appeared. He found the document folded inside a surveyor's report on the south pasture, tucked there either by accident or by a tidiness so deliberate it amounted to concealment. It was a copy, a careful, faithful, entirely legible copy of the register entry for the Church of St. Giles the Abbot, November the 12th, 1809. His own name, Eleanor Vane. The vicar's signature, which he remembered watching dry. The witnesses, 2 farmers from the village whose names he had not thought of since. He sat down. He did not remember choosing to sit. The chair was the one his guardian had occupied for 30 years, leather-worn, pale at the arms, and Julian found himself gripping those pale patches as though the room had begun to move. The clock on the mantel continued its work, indifferent and meticulous, marking a silence he could not yet measure. He had been told that Eleanor's family had written to his guardian within the year, that they had found the marriage unsuitable, that they wished it undone, that Eleanor herself had not objected. He had been 19, newly come into a title that felt like a coat 3 sizes too large, and his guardian had laid the letter before him with the steady patience of a man delivering unpleasant news he had hoped to spare. "She does not want it known," the old man had said. "She has asked that you not write." Julian had written once a careful letter, formal with wounded pride, and when no reply came he had understood it as confirmation. He had understood nothing. He sat in the unlit study and reconstructed 8 years the way a man reconstructs a collapsed building, piece by careful piece, and with a growing certainty that the foundation had been false from the beginning. Eleanor's single reply, which had reached him late and confused, answering questions he had not asked. He had read it as evasion. The 2 subsequent letters he had sent, which she had apparently never received, or he had never sent, or his guardian had conveyed elsewhere. The long years of her silence, which he had permitted himself to experience as indifference, because indifference was bearable, and the alternative was not. She had been at Ashvere Hall for 6 weeks. She had sat across the breakfast table from him and listened while Miss Arabella Ford spoke of the improvements she intended to make to the East Gallery. She had borne it with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to keep their countenance under conditions that would unmake a less disciplined soul. She had not told him. He could not decide in that cold study with the clock ticking and no fire and the document in his hands whether her silence had been pride or mercy. Perhaps she herself had not known which it was. When at last he rose, his fingers were stiff with the cold he had not noticed accumulating. He folded the document, not in the way one folds a thing to put it away, but in the careful way one handles something that has altered the shape of all the years surrounding it, and carried it with him through the corridor and up the stairs and along the passage to his aunt's parlour. The door stood a little open, as it always did in the evenings when Lady Cecily preferred the company of quiet occupation to the formality of closed rooms. Through the gap came the low, unhurried sound of a woman reading aloud, that gentle, lyrical voice he had come to listen for in a house where he had not expected to find comfort. He stopped in the doorway. He did not speak. Eleanor sat near the lamp with the book open in her hands, her profile composed, the lamplight laying its amber economy across her cheek, and he listened for what seemed a very long time to the story she was reading, though he retained no word of it. Then she turned a page and looked up, and for one unguarded moment her expression held everything the 8 years had cost, not anger, not reproach, but a grief so long carried it had grown quiet. He said her name. Not Miss Vane with its careful stranger's distance. Eleanor. She looked at him for a moment, without moving. Then she closed the book very carefully, as one closes a thing one has finished with, or perhaps a thing one intends to return to, when the present hour has run its course. The parterre garden held its breath beneath a skin of frost, each boxwood hedge rimmed in silver, as though the estate itself had aged overnight in sympathy with the hour. Eleanor walked at a measured distance from the Duke, her half-boots pressing shallow impressions into the pale gravel, the cold rising through the thin leather soles with a patient, insistent honesty that the morning's conversation had not yet managed. Their breath clouded and dissolved between them, 2 small ghosts of warmth surrendered to the January air, and Julian spoke into that dissolving space with the careful gravity of a man who knows he is addressing a sentence already passed. He told her of his late guardian's interference, the false letter composed in a hand close enough to hers to deceive a younger, less suspicious mind, The sealed correspondence turned back at the post, the deliberate murmuring into his ear during those first raw months that she had chosen silence because she had chosen distance. He told her of his own failure, which he did not soften or abbreviate, the season he had spent in Edinburgh convincing himself that grief was dignity, the winter he had accepted absence as answer without demanding proof. His voice did not plead. It reported with the unflinching steadiness of a man reading aloud from his own account books and finding the column irredeemably short. Eleanor listened, without interrupting. She had spent 8 years learning the uses of silence, and she employed it now, not as cruelty, but as precision. She would hear every word before she offered a single one of her own. When he finished, the parterre held only the sound of their footsteps on gravel and the distant complaint of a rook somewhere beyond the yew boundary. Then Eleanor spoke, and she did not speak of feelings as a general country. She spoke of objects. One room at her cousin's house in Derbyshire, the ceiling low enough that she could press her palm flat to the plaster on cold mornings and feel the house breathe around her. One trunk, her mother's, the brass fittings gone green, in which she had kept the single document that proved she was anything other than a woman of uncertain attachment and uncertain future. No one to tell. Not the cousin whose kindness was genuine but whose discretion could not be trusted with anything that touched consequence. Not the solicitor she had approached in the 3rd year, who had looked at her marriage lines and then at her and suggested she consult a clergyman instead. She recited these things without anger, which was, Julian understood, considerably worse than anger. Anger would have given him somewhere to press against. This quiet inventory of a life conducted in a single room around a single trunk without a single confidant offered him nothing to push back from, only the still surface of what had actually occurred. He offered, then, to make the marriage public immediately. He said the word immediately with a weight that indicated he meant it as restitution rather than strategy. Eleanor turned to look at him for the first time in several minutes, her expression neither warm nor closed, but something more difficult, attentive, in the way one is attentive to a question that must be answered honestly or not at all. She asked what that would mean for her, not what it would repair for him, not what it would resolve for the estate or for the position of an unacknowledged duchess in the county's estimation, what it would mean for Eleanor Vane, who had learned in 8 years of quiet to ask after her own circumstances before she agreed to anything. He had no answer that satisfied either of them. He knew it, and did not pretend otherwise. They reached the garden gate where the parterre met the south lawn, the iron latch rimed with frost, a spider's abandoned architecture strung between the posts and hung with tiny beads of ice, each one catching the weak winter light with a fleeting exactness. Eleanor opened the gate, passed through, and did not look back as she walked toward the house. He remained where he stood. The cold settled around him with the ease of something long accustomed to his company. The garden perfectly still, the morning offering no verdict, only the slow, indifferent turning of another hour in which the account between them remained open, and the first word of its resolution had not yet been written. The frost had not lifted by noon, and Ashvere Hall held the cold inside it as a church holds silence, not as absence, but as presence, deliberate and watchful. The long windows of the east corridor gathered grey light from a sky that refused to commit to weather, and the house itself seemed to draw breath and hold it, waiting for something it already knew was coming. It arrived in a dark chaise, unhurried, the wheels crunching over the avenue gravel with the particular authority of men who carry documents rather than emotions. Mr. Ford's solicitor descended with a leather satchel worn smooth at its brass clasp, and his face wore that expression common to solicitors of the period, the expression of a man who has learned to present ruination with the courtesy of a calling card. He was shown into the library, and the library, which had witnessed Julian's confession the evening before, received him without welcome. Julian did not rise from behind the desk when the satchel was opened. The document that emerged was folded with a precision that suggested it had been prepared some days prior, which was to say that someone had been attending to the matter of Eleanor Vane's existence with a patience that admitted no surprises. The solicitor described it in his careful, measured voice as a mutual release, a phrase that had the quality of cold water applied to a wound, simultaneously cleansing and merciless. He noted, with professional delicacy, that the lady's reputation was the principal concern of those who had commissioned the instrument, that 8 years of an unacknowledged union cast shadows that a swift and quiet annulment might mercifully dissolve before they hardened into permanent form. Julian looked at the document for a long moment and did not touch it. He said that he would not sign. The solicitor folded his hands and said that was entirely the Duke's prerogative, and that the offer would remain open. Lady Cecily had been in the adjoining sitting-room. She emerged, as she tended to emerge from such situations, at precisely the right moment and with precisely the wrong gift. She found Eleanor in the upper corridor, having intercepted the document from the hall table where a footman had unwisely set it, and she placed it in Eleanor's hands without preamble and without apology, which was the most honest thing she could have offered. Eleanor stood in the corridor's thin light, and read it. The language was impeccable, as the language of erasure always is when sufficient money has paid for its phrasing. It named her. It named him. It named 8 years in the way that death notices name the dates between a birth and an ending, reducing duration to a formality. Eleanor's face, Lady Cecily would later recall, showed nothing that could be called legible. The expression was not grief, nor anger, nor the brittle brightness of a woman performing composure. It was the expression of someone who has for many years rehearsed the possibility of a particular loss and discovers, now that the paper makes it real, that the rehearsal has not made the role easier, but only more familiar. From the avenue below came the sound of the Ford carriage, the wheels on gravel again, but moving outward now, that particular diminishing sound of departure that old houses know better than any other, because old houses have heard so many kinds of leaving. No bell was rung for farewell. No one appeared at the upper windows to observe the chaise as it turned at the park gate. The Ford family's connection to Ashvere concluded as minor stories conclude, not with resolution, but with the quiet absorption of their absence into the house's longer narrative. Eleanor descended to the study Julian had vacated. The grate held the cold residue of last evening's fire, and nothing more. She set the document upon the iron dogs with the care one extends to objects whose value one is still deciding, and she did not reach for the tinderbox on the mantel shelf. The choice of flame, she understood, was not hers to make unilaterally. She had made enough solitary decisions in 8 years. She left the paper lying open in the grey ash, waiting, as the house waited, as the season itself seemed to wait, suspended between the last hard frost and the first faint suggestion that the cold might eventually consent to end. The great hall of Ashvere smelled of candle, tallow, and old stone, the way it always did when winter had settled deep into the walls. A fire burned in the hearth, not the intimate grate of the study, but the broad ceremonial fireplace that dominated the hall's northern face, wide enough to stand within, old enough to have consumed the correspondence of 4 preceding dukes. It was before this fire that Julian Ashvere now stood, and the household had gathered because he had asked them to, which was a thing he had never once done in 8 years of holding the title. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, stood nearest the door, her hands folded at her waist with the stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is the only safe response to the unexpected. Behind her, 3 footmen arranged themselves with the uncertain posture of men who wished they were somewhere else. Near the tall window, where frost had traced its lacework across the lower panes, Lady Cecily stood in her travelling clothes, her face holding the expression of someone who has rehearsed several things to say and finds, now that the moment has arrived, that none of them will serve. The visiting vicar, Mr. Alcott, stood slightly apart from all of them, his gaze moving carefully between the Duke and the fireplace, as though he were attempting to determine whether he had been summoned as a witness or as a clergyman. Eleanor stood to the right of the hearth. She had not been asked to stand there. She had simply come to rest in that place, and she had not moved since because the stone floor was solid beneath her, and the fire was warm at her side, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was not afraid. The document lay on the small iron table beside the grate, exactly where Julian had set it after retrieving it from the study, a single folded sheet, cream-coloured, bearing a solicitor's seal and the tidy script of a man paid to make dissolution sound like kindness. Julian did not look at it for a long moment. He looked at the assembled faces before him, at Mrs. Pell's careful stillness, at the footman's studied posture, at his aunt's careful jaw. And then he looked at Eleanor briefly, the way one looks at a fixed point when one needs to remember which direction is north. He picked up the document. He unfolded it once, as though verifying for the last time what it contained. Then he held it to the fire. The paper took the flame at its corner, tentative and then committed, the solicitor's seal darkening and curling before it brightened and vanished. Julian held it by the unmarked edge until the fire reached his fingers, and then he released it into the grate, and they all watched it finish. The house made its winter sound, the low tick and settle of old timbers, and in that sound was something that might have been relief, or merely age. Julian spoke into the silence. He said that Eleanor Vane was his wife. He said that she had been his wife for 8 years, married in the village church in November 1809. He said that the register had existed and had been suppressed, and that the suppression had been his failure to prevent and his failure to discover, and that he would answer any question the household or the vicar required of him. He did not say it as a speech. He said it the way one states a thing that has always been true and has simply been waiting for the room in which to become known. The footman nearest the door looked at the floor. Mrs. Pell did not move, but something in her face settled, as though a door she had been holding shut for a very long time had finally been permitted to close. Lady Cecily crossed the room. She took Eleanor's hand, not with the pressing urgency of apology, but with the quiet deliberateness of a woman claiming something she considers rightfully hers to claim, and Eleanor felt the papery warmth of the older woman's fingers and understood, without either of them speaking, that this was acceptance rather than comfort. Mrs. Pell, behind them, had begun with great discretion to weep. The vicar was writing something in a small notebook he had produced from his coat pocket, which was, Eleanor thought, exactly the right response from a man of his profession. Eleanor herself did not weep. She stood in the warm hall of a house that had kept her secret longer than she had kept it herself, and she felt something in her chest that was not happiness exactly, not yet, but was the strange and unfamiliar sensation of a weight becoming at last evenly distributed. Julian crossed the room. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his coat sleeve against her arm, and he did not reach for her hand. He stood there, as he had stood before the fire, and he waited, with the particular patience of a man who has finally understood that permission is not a weakness, but the only honest beginning. The morning she named her condition, the frost had crept inward from the window glass and left pale ferns across the sill, as though Ashvere Hall itself were pressing close to listen. Eleanor stood at the far end of the library, her back half turned to the fire, and Julian waited in the manner of a man who has learned, at great cost, the value of stillness. She did not speak immediately. The mantel clock measured out the silence in small, indifferent strokes, and the coals shifted once, settling lower, before she turned and met his eyes with a steadiness that had taken her 8 years to cultivate. She asked to be taken to the church, not St. Clement's in the city, not the chapel at Ashvere that the family used for feast days and christenings. The village church, the one with the low stone porch and the iron latch that stiffened in cold weather, and the register kept in the vestry cupboard behind the door that swelled in winter. The church where, on a Thursday morning in November of 1809, 2 witnesses, whose names she still remembered, had written themselves into the margins of her life. Julian looked at her for a long moment. He did not ask why. He said only that they would go that morning if she wished it, and she nodded once, and that was the whole of the conversation. The carriage was brought round before 9 o'clock. The gravel drive lay rigid with frost beneath the wheels, and the sound of it, that particular grinding crunch, each stone locked in its shell of ice, was the loudest thing on the air as they rolled beneath the bare elms toward the village road. Inside the carriage they sat across from one another in the customary manner, and very little passed between them beyond the occasional creak of the springs and the white plume of their breath rising and dissolving in the cold. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap. Julian watched the hedgerows. The village received them without ceremony, which was as she had wished. The church key was obtained from the verger, a small man with the unhurried movements of someone who lived entirely outside the drama of great houses, and he led them through the side door with no more interest than if they had come to examine the roof. The vestry smelled of damp stone and candle wax, and the faint ghost of old paper, a smell Eleanor had not encountered in 8 years, and yet recognized with the whole of her body, the way one recognizes a voice heard only once in childhood. The register was where it had always been, the current volume shelved above the older ones, and the older ones above the older ones, still, each year pressed against the next, in a column of fading spines. Julian found the volume for 1809 and set it on the vestry table without being asked. Eleanor opened it herself. The pages were stiff and cool to the touch, and she turned them carefully, by the corners, past baptisms and burials and the ordinary measurements of parish life, until she found the entry she was looking for. The ink had browned with the years as ink does, the blacks softened to amber, the finer strokes grown thread-like, but the words were perfectly legible, set down in the careful hand of a clerk who had taken his office seriously. Her name. His name. The date in November. the two witnesses each signing with the neat deliberateness of people who understood they were performing a small act of permanence. Eleanor placed the tip of one finger on the line where her name was written and did not move for a moment. She was not reading. She was simply there, present in the fact of it, the way one is sometimes present in the fact of one's own reflection. Not surprised, but confirmed. Julian stood at her shoulder and watched her face. She was aware of his watching, and she allowed it. When she closed the register, she pressed both palms flat against the cover for a breath, then lifted them and straightened. She said she was ready to go home. It was the first time she had used that word for Ashvere Hall, the first time in 8 years the word had arranged itself in her mouth as something other than the name of a place she was merely passing through, and it settled into the cold vestry air and remained there, very quietly, as they walked back out into the frost. The shutters had been latched so long that they resisted at first, swollen against their frames as wood will do when it has grown accustomed to the dark, but one by one over the days that followed, they were persuaded open, and the pale winter light of 1817 came slowly in, laying itself across floors that had forgotten the sensation of brightness, touching the corners of rooms that had been sealed since some earlier sorrow no one now named aloud. Ashvere Hall was learning, cautiously, how to breathe again. The dust sheets came down from the furniture in the green drawing-room, folded, with the careful deliberateness of a household that understood the gravity of an ending. The pressed damask settee revealed beneath, a little faded along one arm, and patient as something that had always expected to be found. The grate in that room had been cold for years, cold enough that when the first fire was laid and lit, the chimney drew reluctantly, as though startled to be asked to serve again, and the warmth it offered was tentative, exploratory, feeling its way outward along the walls. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the flames establish themselves and said nothing, because there was nothing that words could have improved upon. She walked the estate in those days with the Duke and with the steward whose name was Holcroft, and who wore a coat of heavy wool and carried always a small ledger tucked under one arm like a child carrying a treasure. They moved together through the frozen kitchen gardens and along the lane to the home farm, through the village to the tied cottages where the tenants met them at their doors with the particular expression of people who have received unexpected news and are still deciding what to feel about it. The Duke introduced her each time with the same directness, unhurried, without embellishment, the Duchess of Ashvere. And she heard those words fall into each silence and settle there, and she met each pair of eyes steadily, and she began to learn names, names of children, names of fields, the name of a tenant's eldest son, recently apprenticed to a millwright in the market town, the name of a cow that had apparently distinguished herself in some local competition, the details of which were delivered to Eleanor with great solemnity, and she received them with equal gravity, understanding instinctively that this was how a place was known. One morning she found on her dressing table a pair of gloves. They were plain, unornamented, of good soft leather cut to fit a woman's hand, and they had not been there the evening before. Her old pair, darned at the left forefinger until the darn itself had needed darning, she had folded and left beside the washstand without remark, and now these new ones lay in their place, also without remark, and she stood looking at them for a moment before she put them on, which fit as though they had been made precisely for her, which perhaps they had, and she did not mention them to anyone, and no one mentioned them to her, and the matter existed entirely in the register of small understandings between two people who were, it appeared, beginning to speak in that language. Lady Cecily departed on a clear morning when the frost had been particularly thorough and the gravel of the drive crunched underfoot like something being slowly thought through. She kissed Eleanor's cheek and declared, with the cheerful authority of a woman who has arranged many things satisfactorily, that the house no longer required her supervision and that she was wanted in Bath, where there was apparently a young woman of her acquaintance in need of guidance of a rather different sort. She said this with a brightness that suggested she was thoroughly pleased with herself, and the coach took her away, and Ashvere Hall closed its door behind her, and was quiet, and was its own again. In the library that evening the candle between them burned without guttering, the flames so steady it might have been painted there. Eleanor turned a page. Julian's pen moved across the ledger before him in the measured strokes of a man engaged in necessary work. The fire spoke quietly to itself in the grate. Outside, the cold settled into the grounds with its old authority, pressing against the glass, and the house held as houses do when they have remembered at last what they are for. The smell of old cedar and lavender water came first, that particular mingling of preservation and memory that belongs to trunks left unopened too long. Eleanor had been putting off the task for 3 days, finding reasons to move through other rooms, to arrange books that were already arranged, to stand before windows and watch the bare linden trees on the south lawn as though they required her attention. But on the morning of the 4th day, with frost still furred along the lower panes and a fire newly laid in the dressing-room, she knelt before the trunk and began properly. She had carried it from lodging to lodging across 8 years, Bath, then a village outside Cirencester, then back to Bath, the iron clasps acquiring small rust blooms she had rubbed away each time with the corner of a cloth. She had lived out of it rather than from it, in the way one lives beside a thing one does not entirely wish to open. The gowns came out first, and the 2 shawls, and the leather writing case with its broken hinge, and then her fingers found the silk lining at the base, and the lining shifted, and there was the particular sound, faint, papery, of something that should not have been there. The letter had been folded small, as though to take up as little space as possible, and sealed with a wafer she had never sent. The date, written on the outer fold, was from the 3rd year of their marriage, in her own hand, in ink turned the pale amber of weak tea. She did not read it in the trunk-room. She carried it to the chair nearest the fire, and sat for a long moment with it between both palms, feeling the slight bow of the paper the way one might test whether a thing is still alive. When she broke the seal it came apart quietly, without protest, as though it had been waiting. She had written it in November. She could tell by the lines about the cold following her from room to room in her lodgings, how the fire never seemed to establish itself properly against the damp. She had written it the morning after a dream, in which she had walked through Ashvere in early spring, through rooms she had never seen, past a window that looked south onto a garden where someone had planted sweet briar along a low stone wall. In the dream, the house had been warm and entirely her own, and she had described it in the letter with a precision that embarrassed her now, the imagined colour of the wallpaper in a room she invented, the sound of a particular door she had given herself permission to open. The letter was tender, and it was furious, and it asked questions she had been too proud to send, and described a life she had been too hopeful to surrender. She read it through to the end without stopping, and when she finished, she sat very still while the fire spoke quietly to itself, and the frost on the panes softened by one thin degree. She did not fold it again. She walked through the corridor to the library where Julian stood at the writing table with letters of estate, the kind that arrive in thickening November envelopes, smelling of office wax and obligation. She placed her letter beside his papers and said nothing, and left the room. She heard him from the corridor. Not words, simply the cessation of his other sounds, the setting down of his pen, the single slow exhale that meant he had begun to read. She waited by the window at the corridor's end, watching the south lawn where the linden trees stood stripped and patient. It was a long while before she heard his footstep, and when she turned, he was in the doorway with the letter in his hand, and his back not quite to the light. He asked, in a voice she did not fully recognize, whether she would have come sooner if she had sent it. She considered the question honestly, as it deserved. She said she did not know. He folded the letter along its original creases with the care one gives a thing that has already survived too much carelessness, and she followed him back into the library, and he opened the book of surveying maps, that large, cloth-bound volume, from the table where they had first stood together, tracing margins, and placed the letter inside, between 2 pages, and closed the cover. He set it back in its place on the shelf without a word. The library held the silence as libraries do, receiving it without complaint, and outside the frost continued its slow retreat from the lower panes, and the house breathed around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely their own. The earth smelled of rain and turned loam that first mild morning, a scent so particular to the Ashvere kitchen garden that Eleanor had learned it by heart years before she had any right to call it hers. She stood at the far end of the herb border, her hem darkened with mud to the ankle, a paper of seeds in her left hand, her right gesturing toward the clay markers the undergardener had pressed into the soil. "Sweet marjoram here," she said, "the thyme further along where the wall holds the afternoon warmth." He nodded and moved, and Eleanor watched him go with the unhurried authority of a woman who had, at last, ceased to apologize for knowing her own mind. The rooks were loud in the elm, arguing above the avenue of beeches whose pale new leaves had opened in the night, like the pages of a book left too long unread. Spring had not arrived all at once. It had come the way honest feeling comes gradually, and then with a certainty that made all the waiting seem less like loss and more like preparation. She did not hear the Duke approach. She rarely did. Julian moved through his own estate with a quietness that had once struck her as guardedness, and now struck her simply as his nature, a man more comfortable with presence than announcement. He appeared at her elbow with no particular errand about him, his coat unbuttoned against the mild air, and looked at the newly turned border as though it genuinely interested him. "Is that where the barrage goes?" he asked. She told him it was not, that barrage required more sun and less company, and he accepted this with the small smile he reserved for moments when she knew more than he did, which in the kitchen garden was nearly always. She handed him the end of the twine, and he held it, without being asked, for the better part of an hour, adjusting his grip when she required it, saying very little. The morning moved around them. It was a child who broke that quiet, a tenant daughter from the home farm, 5 or 6 years old, come along the garden path with the solemn purposefulness of a child who has decided upon an errand. She held out a fistful of early crocuses, purple and white, stems damp from the grass, and offered them to Eleanor with the gravity of a formal gift. Eleanor took them with both hands. She thanked the child by name, which she knew because she had made it her business to know the names of every child on the estate, and held the flowers against her coat as though they were a bouquet, rather than a muddy handful from a field. The child ran back the way she had come. The Duke said nothing, but his eyes, when they met Eleanor's, had that quality she had come to recognize, the quality of a man noting a thing down somewhere he does not expect to forget. They walked back to the house when the morning had warmed enough to soften the path, side by side along the kitchen garden wall, and their hands found each other near the gate, without discussion and without ceremony, the way two people find each other when they have stopped pretending there is any sensible reason not to. Eleanor did not remark upon it, neither did he. The house came into view as they turned onto the avenue, Ashvere Hall in early light, the stone the colour of pale honey. One window lit on the upper floor where the housemaids had begun their morning work, smoke rising from two chimneys in long, unhurried columns. The rooks circled the great elm, describing their loose and ancient patterns against a sky that had remembered how to be blue. It was not a house that had ever been built for softness. Its proportions were too formal, its history too long, its silences too practiced. But a house is also what happens inside it. And what had happened inside Ashvere in these past weeks, the naming, the returning, the letter laid quietly to rest, had altered something in its character that no architect could have drawn and no inventory could record. Eleanor looked at it a moment before they reached the door. She felt the crocuses in her hand and the weight of Julian beside her, and the mud still drying on her hem, and the smell of turned earth following them up the avenue, and she thought, not with drama, not with ceremony, but with the plain satisfaction of a thing that has taken a long time to become true, that she was home.